Welcome, everyone, to the Cardano Effect Podcast, episode 94. The purpose of this podcast is to take high-level developer information and projects that are occurring within the Cardano space and break them down into bite-sized, consumable pieces of information for everyday use. I'm your host, Philippe, and let's get this podcast started. Rick and myself are the hosts of the Cardano Effect, and we have Sebastien returning today, which is awesome. And we have a lot of guests on the Cardano Effect podcast today, so we want to get right into the mix of things. So I would like to let everyone know that none of what we say on this podcast is financial advice. Remember, you are your best financial advisor, and if you don't think you are, you need to find someone who's qualified to do so. Rick, it is Saturday morning. How are you doing? What's going on?
Hey, doing great, Philippe. Doing great. Thank you. I'd like to give a shout out to the Cardano Foundation for sponsoring this podcast. Thank you very much, Cardano Foundation. We appreciate your support. I'd also like to remind viewers that this podcast is available on all major audio streaming platforms. So if you're working out or driving in your car, you can listen to the podcast on audio only. So with that said, I would like to welcome Matthias back to the Cardano Effect podcast here. And we have a new guest, Frederic Johnson, who's going to be talking with us about Cardano Improvement Proposals, how they work. And we're going to start off with, how did CIPs start? Cardano Improvement Proposals, how did they start? What's the origin? Matthias and Sebastien, would you like to tell us about that, please?
Sebastien, do you want to start or should I?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, we have two wallets that are the primary wallets in the ecosystem. One of them is stateless, which is the full node. And the other one, Udoi, which is the kind of light client. Now, obviously, our teams have to talk a lot with each other to coordinate on functionality, right? For example, when Jormungandr was released, we need to agree, okay, how do we handle Jormungandr wallets? How do we generate the addresses? How do we make sure that if you enter the same recovery phrase, you get the same wallet? All this kind of technical detail. So this requires coordination between us as entities, but I'll say this is not enough if you want to have a truly open ecosystem, right? So if another company wants to make a wallet, they should not have to go talk to Emergo or go talk to ISK to find out the secret sauce. They should be able to find a publicly accessible document that describes exactly how things work and what they need to do to create a wallet that's fully compatible with Udoi and Daedalus. Now, to do this, we need to have a standardized location to put all these documents. So not only can people go read it, but they can also propose new ideas, which is also important. So if a new company comes into the ecosystem and they say, well, you've done is great, but I need this new thing, they need to have the central repository to propose an idea, discuss the idea, and if people like the idea, then we can eventually move to include it in the ecosystem. So this is, a part of opening our ecosystem to everybody who wants to get involved. And this CIP process is, how do we take these ideas, put them in a central location, and have the agreed upon way of discussing and debating any new ideas that are proposed.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good idea. Is there some history behind this? There's other cryptocurrencies with improvement proposals. What's the history behind that?
Yeah. So, we're not reinventing the wheel here, right? Especially because, as a lot of people know, Cardano is a UTXO blockchain. So a lot of things that applies to Bitcoin can be applied to Cardano to some extent. And Cardano wallets actually make great use of existing proposals that were proposed for Bitcoins, actually. So the hierarchical wallets that we have right now on Jormungandr and the Shelly testnet, they come from originally a Bitcoin paper proposal that was made by community members and a few other things like that. So that was something very interesting that was open and, as Sebastien said, accessible for anyone in the community. And, well, we wanted kind of the same thing for Cardano. Right.
Okay. So can you frame this? Let's take it back. So what is the Cardano Improvement Proposal? How does it relate to the everyday, investor versus developer versus just random person within the Cardano ecosystem, Cardano enthusiast? Who is it for? What's the purpose?
So if you think of the Cardano Improvement Proposal process or the improvement proposal process that you have across cryptocurrencies, it's kind of like thinking arbitrarily as a manual or documentation. So for example, your car manual, it has a lot of good information in it, but it's not your car. It's a manual. It's It gives you some tools that you can use or some information. The same way the Cardano Improvement Proposal process or the CIP process gets to open up some tools to the community. So it's a platform for communication, as we mentioned, for coordination, but also for information. So you can share details that you want about like a tool that you're building, or for IOHK to share, or for Emirgo to share, and for everybody to coordinate on. In regards to investors, traditional users, you have if you're a community member that wants to propose a new change to the Cardano blockchain, previously there was no straightforward or formalized process to do so. With the CIP process, this is a way to open up to the community so that individual members can propose a change that they want to see implemented. And that change will go through formalized structure so people can discuss it, and it'll be touching all levels, including like Emirgo, the Cardano Foundation, and IOHK. So this is the collective process to try to get changes implemented or processes. However, the clear distinction is the addition of a CIP in the repository is just like a new page in your car manual. It might be useful, but it doesn't mean that it's actually being added. You know, it might be just like the special model that has like the sunroof and your car doesn't have it. So it doesn't mean that because it's added in the CIP repository, it's actually added in the protocol. So there's multiple layers of progression that way.
Okay.
That was a great description, Frederic. I like your analogies and examples using a car. And so what are the greatest benefits of using a Cardano improvement process as opposed to a couple of lead system engineers and designers to say, this is how it's going to work, boom, stick to this or you don't get to play? What's the benefits to this process?
Yeah, so I can take that one. So I think there's kind of two groups that may care about this. One is people who are developing software that is not related to the chain itself, right? So for example, a new wallet wants to come in and they have a great idea and they want to have Yoroi or Daedalus introduce this. If they come to us directly and say, hey, I'm a developer, I want this feature, please implement this, and they send it to me via email, there's nothing I can do with that, right? I'm going to have to ask them, like, can you link to me like a specific document that exactly describes what you want? Then we can have a discussion and we can do a security audit and we can move forward with it. So I think it's a very useful tool for developers. But there's the other set of people, which is the users of the protocol, who may care about treasury funding or who may care about on-chain voting. And those are not directly related to CIPs, the Cardano Improvement Proposals, but the Cardano Improvement Proposals make them much easier, right? So for example, imagine you want to make a treasury proposal in the future, and you say, I want to have, $1 million to implement this complex idea or whatnot. The best way to get the money is to have a concrete proposal that you've written that describes exactly what you're going to do, right? So you can make a proposal that says, I want money to build this new feature. And look, we already have a CIP that discusses this in detail, exactly how it's going to work. And you can see a history of the discussion about, the pros and cons. And you can see, Emirgo signed off on it, IOHK signed off on it. This person said it was a good idea. So it leaves kind of an audit trail of the technical discussion that you might not otherwise have.
That's a great example because, right now there is over 100 million ADA in the treasury on the ITN. So I like your example. So Sebastien, let me give you another example here. And if you guys can help walk me through this. Currently, one of the most talked about things is, should we continue the ITN? Like, should we add another month? Now, there are pros and cons to doing that. There's consumption of resources, level of effort. It's going to take a lot of work for a lot of developers to make that happen. So let's say that, can you walk me through it? Let's say this idea gets thrown out there. What is step 1, step 2, and step 3 on how that idea would get introduced to the process? Where would I start?
Right. So the thing about the CIP process is that usually you want to discuss some technical proposal, right? And restarting the ITN is not really a technical proposal. It's kind of, you're restarting the network. So you're not proposing any particular change. What you might see is, for example, imagine we want to restart the ITN. Somebody goes, well, wait a minute. If we restart the ITN and it stays as a separate blockchain forever, maybe we should have some sort of new number in the way addresses are derived, so that if you generate a public key or a private key on the mainnet, it gives you a different private and public key on Jormungandr. Because right now, if you generate a private key on Jormungandr, it'll be the same private key on Haskell Selling mainnet. Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great example. So how would I start that process?
And so what you would do is you would go to the SIP repository, and you can say, we want to do a Jormungandr reboot. We want to have a new Genesis block. And to make sure that there are no problems with the existing Haskell mainnet, we think we need to change the following things. We need to change the address derivation, maybe change something else, blah, blah, blah. And you package this all up into one document, and just a markdown document, like a kind of a Word file. And you put this up there on the GitHub repository. And then you send this to the ITN community, right? You post on Telegram, post on Twitter, and you tell them, this is what I think we need to do to make sure that the ITN could stay as a separate blockchain and work together well with the existing mainnet. And then everybody in the ITN community can read this document and say, okay, now I know exactly what the change was going to stay the same. And if one of the pool operators looks at it and goes like, well, wait a minute, what if we need to change this? Then we can have a discussion and figure out, okay, like based on their experience, they know this needs to change, and we can have a discussion about exactly what we need to change to do this reboot.
Okay, that sounds good. So it sounds like the process it'll encourage community buy-in, and it will get a lot of people thinking on it so that you would hope to achieve the best possible solution. So is that the general idea?
Yeah. Generally, I think that for big changes like restarting the ITN and so on, we're talking about like a separate class of proposal even. So it's likely outside, I think, of the frame of the CIP. The CIPs are very focused on the chain, on Cardano itself, but what you're talking about might be like constitutional, some way of a little bit bigger than that. Again, the CIP is just a tool to be used, but it doesn't force you to use it as the tool. The changes that IOHK is currently pushing in Cardano are changes that are not like CIP driven. They've been like research driven, and they've been implemented and planned ahead of time. It's not something that is magically coming just right now with the CIP process. The CIP is just coming together to help the community see what is currently being proposed by other members of the community or new people within IOHK or Emurgo.
Yeah,
so
you might see the CIP as like a catalog of solutions to existing problems or the problems that might exist, right? People think, okay, if considering this particular problem, I have thought of this technical solution. And then the solution is laid down on the paper. You have the rationale and motivations. You have some possibly, ideas of implementation for that particular solution. And then if you're building an application and you run into the problem, well, you already have a solution that has been reviewed by people and, thought of. So you might not even need to put the effort yourself into thinking about finding a solution. It's already there for you, right? So the idea is really to share that.
So go ahead, Sebastien, sorry.
Yeah, I think something that might help people understand is, imagine we go back to the treasury example I mentioned earlier, right? So somebody wants to make a treasury proposal. To have a higher chance of the treasury proposal being accepted, they first write a technical document that says exactly how their new feature is going to work. Okay, so they said, okay, I'm going to write a SIP. I'm going to submit it to the Cardano Improvement Proposal repository, and they have a long discussion about it. And at the end of the day, it's possible Emurgo approves, IOHK approves, maybe other people in the community approve, and then when they make the treasury proposal as a motivation for why they should get funding, they say, I like my idea, these are the benefits, plus all these other people also said it's a good idea. But just because they got a SIP approved does not mean the treasury proposal be approved, right? So we could have a perfectly valid SIP that everybody thinks is a good idea and is part of the Cardano Improvement Proposal repository, but it was never implemented into the protocol, right? So as mentioned before, it's a catalog of ideas where people can discuss ideas, vet ideas, and so on. But just because it's approved as a CIP does not mean it will get funding, does not mean it will pass non-chain vote, does not even mean it will be included into the protocol in any way.
Is there a decision tree that decides what CIP, who develops it? Like if it's a community volunteer developer who's then now going to be funded for that, or if it falls in the domain of Emergo because it's an Emergo related responsibility or an IOHK related responsibility, does that take place in the CIP process also? Like you say, no, that's definitely something that IOHK needs to do, or definitely something Emergo needs to do, or how's that work?
Not really, because you could have more than one person implementing a proposal, right? For instance, there is right now a CIP that we've written with Sebastien, and we have implemented that in both Yoroi and Daedalus, right? So that was something we needed to agree on during the ITN, and it was easier to write a document clearly describing that. Also because then other wallets like Adalite, for instance, might also use that to implement the same thing as us and be compatible with the same wallets. So there is no one implementer of a CIP, and who is going to implement the CIP is also out of scope in a way. That goes for the treasury proposals, possibly, or through other channels. But the CIP stops at explaining what the idea is. Who is going to implement that? It's out of the picture a bit. And it might not even get implemented, right? There are a lot of proposals there, to go back to the Bitcoin land, for instance, that are there on the Bitcoin proposals as well, and that have never been implemented. So it might be the case as well that we have some CIP that are very good idea, but there are still just no use case for them or no business case for them.
Okay, so CIP may get approved, but it might sit on the shelf for a year or 2 years or forever.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
I think another example I think might help people understand is with Ethereum. So if you're familiar with Ethereum, at some point there was a large bug that caused millions of dollars to be frozen, right?
Oops.
And now obviously the people who lost the money were upset that this happened. And so they created an Ethereum improvement proposal saying, okay, if we were to unfreeze the funds, this is what we need to change in the protocol. We need to change this line of code, we need to change how this works, and this is how we would unfreeze the fund. And they packaged this as an Ethereum improvement proposal. Now the fact that they created this proposal does not mean anybody will actually implement this. And as you can see, this proposal was made years ago and nobody ever implemented it, and nobody seemingly at the time now wants to implement this, right? So it's possible to have a completely valid proposal that describes technically how you would do something and the goal and so on, but just because it's technically sound does not mean anybody actually wants to implement it.
Okay, so in a decentralized environment, I could see how that could occur. And, the nice thing is that in Cardano, we've looked at other blockchains, what they're doing and how it's working. We're learning from other blockchains and using that to make a better or make a logical Cardano improvement proposal process. Have you guys learned from other blockchains, like in the example Sebastien just gave? You see how that works and say, hey, this is what we can do for Cardano, right?
Yeah. No, regarding the Cardano improvement process or proposal, when we actually started coming together, IOHK, Emergo, and the foundation, to try to frame this as that collective process we can all normalize and set up like the format that we'd like to communicate over, we had to go and review the previous improvement proposal that came before. And there's a lot of very interesting examples. You have Ethereum, Bitcoin, of course. You have Tezos. Like there's many types of proposal processes, and the way that they're currently working might be slightly different for each of them. Now, all of that feeds into a greater conversation. This is the governance, Voltaire, and so on. We're going to leave that for another time, but we definitely took what lessons we saw from the other elements, and we try to simplify and make things either clearer or just build on the existing systems that have been pushed out. So let me see if I can I do screen share right here? Maybe I can just...
Yes.
Okay, so what we're looking at right there is the Cardano Foundation repository for the CIPs. So you can see where it's currently layered, and you have one folder called CIP1. You have the README. We're going to dig into the CIP1, which describes the CIP process a little bit. So it's a markdown file and typical GitHub layout. You have to be a little familiar, but you can check out the URL right here and see where it's linking. And we're on the CIP1 markdown file, which describes the CIP process. You have an abstract, some specification. In this case, we describe what types of CIP there are. So you have a standard struct CIP, a process CIP, and an informational CIP. So in this context, the CIP1 by itself is a process CIP. It describes the process of submitting a proposal through the entire CIP framework. So this is the sample workflow. You have some idea that gets discussed before by the community, and that idea eventually crystallizes. You get some feedback. The community seems to be discussing it and have a will to implement it. And that's the part at which is going to come in the repository, the Cardano Foundation /CIPs repository as a draft. So from that conceptual discussion, CIP1 is really meant to describe how we go about doing this. And the question you might have are very likely already in the CIP1. For example, how to progress from an idea into a draft CIP. And you can unfold and you can get more additional intel right here. You can, first always remember, just look that idea hasn't been proposed already. Maybe there's been an extended discussion that has gone on at length, but there's one critical point that you weren't thinking about when you had your idea, and that will actually hold you back from proposing it. Or maybe it's already there. So check out where there's public forums like the Cardano Developer Forum, the subreddit, and other places where active conversation is taking place, and see if that conversation has already existed. If it does exist, maybe you want to add to that conversation. If it doesn't, maybe you want to start that conversation. Then the expectation is you formalize all this. Once you've had that conversation going a little bit, post a draft on the forum, on the developer /CIP forum, on the Cardano Foundation forums. You have a draft that you formalize, and then you eventually do, you post a draft to the CIP repository. So you can clone copy the repository, and you do a pull request to it with your CIP as draft. And what it is you want a properly formatted CIP so that conversation can keep going. And that's going to be the part at which CIP editors are going to get involved and tell you hey, you're missing the reason why you have it, or you're missing the abstract, the format, the structure, the implementation. Something is wrong, or it's already been posted, and you'll get that feedback loop until it eventually goes and processes through those statuses that we're currently pushing out. So you can see the conversation happened outside of this graph right here. The conversation feeds into the graph in the draft status. You start drafting your CIP that you want to propose. And again, that CIP can be of the three types. It can be standard, process, or informational. So maybe you have your custom Cardano wallet that you've pushed out, and you want to push out an informational version about how that wallet is slightly different, then you will likely push it through this process. From draft, there's going to be review, and the links are pretty much self-explanatory. You can dig into it a little bit further, but you go from draft to proposed, and before you reach the active stage, you should have a plan to have it proposed and verified as active. And these are the small sub-steps.
Okay, thanks. That is much more clear. And I think one of the important parts is there needs to be some good conversation and dialogue before even putting it into drafts. And I like how it lays out and says, make sure you skim through other existing discussions and proposals. That way we don't have duplicate proposals that are both saying the same thing, and that people have time to talk about it. I also like the part where people can edit it. Is that in the draft stage you just described, where other editors can look at your submission and say, you need to change the word, or you need to add a section, or this might help make it a better proposal? So that looks like a pretty good process so far.
So Matthias and Sebastien have been back and forth with another example of CIP. Do you want to discuss that conversation maybe? Matthias, do you want me to screen share on this?
Yeah, we could describe a bit what's happening. So here, I mean, it's nothing really unusual for developers, right? So people are using GitHub or GitLab or any Git version control system like that. Right, we're making change proposal to the repository, and the platform allows us to discuss those changes, to comment on specific lines on the file, right? And this way you can have a communications directly on the proposal itself. And there is also another channel of communication on the forum, which is coming a bit before the pull request on GitHub, right? So on the forum, you want to discuss ideas, you want to engage with people and see, what they think of what the proposal might look like. And then once you've written an actual proposal, you can just go on GitHub and there have conversation directly on the platform itself, right? Make comments to someone like, it could be about like just small things, changing the way something is written to make it a bit clearer. Or it could be about possible mistakes in the proposals. So here, that's one of the first proposals we've been writing with someone from ITN, like Jonathan here, describing how the coin selection works in Cardano, which is something at the very core of the Cardano wallet. So there is a lot of knowledge in there. There are some rather complex algorithms. And we thought of it might be a good candidate to be described as a CIP and more like to experiment on the process, right? There is no specific demands on that, but it was very well-scoped kind of subject that we could try to put in a CIP and discuss. And it ended up quite well. And we now have a very detailed proposal that explains algorithm steps that give also some test examples, for instance, right? If you wanted to make an implementation, let's say in Python, well, you have test examples that you could use to make sure that your Python implementation is actually implemented correctly. And yeah, it acts both as a documentation and also as a specification document. So yeah, I'm not sure what to add on that.
Oh, no, that's excellent.
I wanted to ask a question. I'm not sure if it's related whatsoever, but when someone is proposing or when someone submits a CIP proposal, where does the funding come in? How do they ask for funds for their particular idea? What if they need X amount of developers and they need to set a budget in order to implement this certain protocol or this certain change within the protocol? Where does that come in?
They actually don't, right? So as I said just a bit before, the CIP ends at the ID, right? Getting funding and getting resources to implement a CIP go through its different channels, right? It will be on the Voltaire era when you can submit proposal on the chain and ask for budget and have people vote for it using real ADA and all the treasury mechanism. But the CIP itself is just the catalog describing the ideas. It doesn't act as a formal way of asking for resources or asking for funding.
I see.
Okay.
But it's a nice first step, right? If you want to ask for funding and you have already an approved CIP that is well documented, you can just say, okay, look, I've got this, discuss with the community, people want that, it has been approved, now I need funding.
I see. So you can have different groups compete for that funding, but the same CIP. So, hey, look, there's a very popular CIP.
Possibly.
And group A, B, and C are all saying, hey, I can do that for X amount and that Y amount. And then the community can vote on that. That's excellent. Hey, can you guys do me a favor? Can you walk me through another example? You were describing at the beginning of the podcast, before we started recording, you were describing that you have one that's in process right now. Was that CIP 2 that you were just showing, or which is the one that Matthias and Sebastien were just working on? Was that 2? Can you tell me how that started and what you guys did to get where you are today?
No, so Actually, I'm going to hand it off to Sebastien or Matthias. I think it's CIP3, right?
Yeah, we can talk about CIP3.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was glad to see you pull up CIP1. So CIP1 in summary there was a description of how to do a CIP. Was that what I saw there?
It's a meta CIP in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It describes
CIP1.
itself.
Yeah. Okay. So CIP1 is how to do a CIP. I love it.
Yeah.
Can't ask for any better than that. Go start at the beginning, right? All right. So guys, tell me how this went down. How did this work out with this CIP number 3?
Yeah, so I can talk about this one. So whenever you're using a wallet, you may have realized that you always need this thing that's called a recovery phrase. Sometimes it's called a mnemonic, right? And what you might not realize is in the background, the wallet software takes these 15 or 12 words and turns those into a private key. Okay, so there's a unique mapping from your set of words to the private key that is generated. Now, the thing is that to do this transformation, you need an algorithm, okay? And so it involves a certain amount of cryptography, and you say, okay, first do this, then do this, and do this, and then after you finish all these calculations, this is the resulting private key. The way people have done this historically has not always been the exact same way. There have been a few different ways to turn a recovery phrase to a private key. Now, this is problematic for anybody who wants to, for example, build a Cardano wallet, because they need to know all the ways possible to add ledger support, add Trezor support, add dayless wallet support and utility wallet support. They need to know what algorithm was used. Okay, so CIP3 is meant to just be a file that describes all the ways that have been used, where they were used and why they were used, and it gives the algorithm and examples. That way, if you're a new wallet who comes into the ecosystem, you can say, okay, I want support for legacy dayless wallets. How does that work? You go to this document, you find the exact algorithm, and now you understand how it works. You can write your code, and once you have your code working, you can test with the examples inside CIP3 to make sure your implementation is correct.
Okay, so you and Matthias wrote this. Matthias again. Sorry, Matthias. You and Matthias wrote this CIP. It shows you guys as the authors. And where's it at in the process now? How to go through? Walk me up to today.
Yeah, so for this one in particular, and a few others actually, it's a bit weird because they were written after the actual implementation was already done, right? So they are describing some existing work. So it's a bit backward in a way, because in the future, moving forward, we want the CIP to be written before and then be implemented. So it's a bit hard to say that these ones cannot be accepted in a way, because they have already been implemented and they are part of the protocol right now. Oh, not
the formalized level, though. The formalized level of it, the structure. So as an informational CIP, in the process right now, they're at the pull request stage. They're not yet in the repository, but we're in the process of reviewing them for correctness. This is the part where we're going to go and get together as editors. We have like bi-weekly meetings where we go and review the past processes or pull requests and say, are they good enough to come in the CIP repo? And it's like, a proofreading, because it's already an existing process.
Yeah, and it's always hard when you write something and when you had the idea in your mind, to make sure that you give all the necessary keys to readers that are not in your mind to also understand your solution fully. And that's why we have these review steps, right? So someone that is not familiar with your proposal might have questions that you have not anticipated. And then this is where you want to reformulate a few sentences, maybe give more examples, make analogies, and make sure that once the proposal is merged in the repository and is available publicly, it is well understood and there is no ambiguity in it, right? And people can just use it without any prior knowledge and do something with it.
Okay. So I have a quick question based on Sebastian's CIP3, the wallet key generation. So can we assume in the future that Emergo and IOHK will be signing off on a lot of the CIPs? Because it's something like this, wallet key generation for future wallets, I mean, this has to be very secure, and you have to make sure that the wallet implementation is not subject to any bugs on the basic end. So like, are people like Sebastien going to be looking at this code consistently and these CIP proposals consistently to make sure that they're safe for implementation? Or could there necessarily be this scenario where someone just that is very technically savvy creates a CIP and it doesn't get approved by the right party, and then all of a sudden we have a larger problem at hand?
Well, I think one good example that works with CIP3 is Trezor. They implemented a feature inside the Trezor wallets called Smear Secret Sharing, which allows you to split your recovery phrase into multiple recovery phrases. That way, you don't have to store it in just one physical location. You can split it into multiple physical locations. Now, to do this obviously changes the way you generate the private key, because instead of having one recovery phrase, you have multiple recovery phrases that you need to combine together. And so the folks at Trezor wrote a proposal for, I believe it was just their own GitHub repository. So they have their own like Satoshi Labs improvement proposals, because Trezor is made by a company called Satoshi Labs. So they have their own GitHub repository for ideas they've come up with. And they said, okay, for Trezor, if you want to have this kind of Smear secret sharing, this is how we're going to transform the recovery phrases into a private key. Now, they didn't ask us for our permission to write this proposal. They did ask us for feedback. And you can still find a Cardano forums thread about this back in like 2019, where they came to the Cardano forums and they said, hey, we're thinking out this proposal. It doesn't just affect Cardano, it affects all the coins you support, but just let us know if there are any problems with this from your side. Right. So this is an example of somebody that comes up with a new algorithm. Sometimes it makes sense for it to be SIP specific if it's for something that's really specific to Cardano. In the case for Trezor, it didn't make sense for it to be Cardano specific. It was just all the coins to support on their hardware wallet, and so they did it their own way, right? But it doesn't force us at Emergo or ITN to necessarily review everything, and it's not always up to us to decide if something will be approved or not.
Okay. So Sebastien, this is kind of interesting. Let's say there's a proposal like this in place, and Emergo and IHK agree, and it's an engineering type decision because it affects how keys are generated and whatever. Let's say a third party out there looks at a Cardano improvement proposal that is proposed and on the table. They can find it here in GitHub, and they think it's effective. Can they simply write the code that implements the proposal and then post it on GitHub to be merged? Now, I don't know how GitHub works well, so if I get this wrong, please correct me. But they could they could implement the proposal and make it available to you guys or to the developers. Is that correct? Can that happen? So you get like community support and contributions coming in on these improvement proposals?
Yes.
Yeah. So something you often see with a proposal is a way to test an implementation. So there's usually a reference implementation along with something you call test vectors, which are example inputs and outputs. So for example, with a CIP3, we have code inside the proposal with some examples of if you give it this input, this is what the expected output should be. And so we would expect this also from anybody else making a technical proposal, if possible, to add code and examples of how it would run and inputs and outputs, and it helps everybody validate that the idea works.
So what we're looking at right here, actually, Matthias, you want to take it?
No, I was maybe going to add something on this to give maybe a concrete example. If you look at the addresses on the ITN, for instance, right, which are prefixed with a very specific string, right, ADDR, or for people that have used with or played with GCLI and stake pools and stuff like that, you had all those private keys, public keys with a nice prefix, right? It was very readable encoding. This is actually coming from also a proposal called BIP 173, I think. And at the time, you could find implementation of that proposal as JavaScript or Python libraries. If you wanted to encode a specific string using this particular encoding, you could do that, right? And there was none in Haskell at that time. So at IOHK, we've written the first one in Haskell using the proposal as the specification document. There were also test vectors in the proposals and a reference implementation in Python and C, I think. So we've written a Haskell one, we've tested that one, and we've been using that one in the Cardano wallet and Daedalus. So that's a great example of an existing proposal that describes a solution for technical problems, and people writing libraries in different languages to make it possible for various applications to then use it.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthias.
Frederic, I have a question for you. So can you walk us through the entire process? How long does it take to get from one stage to the next? What's the time period? And can you give us just a brief rundown of what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So there's the initial conversation that will take as long as it takes until some kind of consensus is built within the community and the developers and everybody involved in that conversation. So that's outside of the CIP process. Then going into the formalized GitHub repo, you go from draft to propose to active. Now, how long you stay in each of those stages is really relevant to how long it takes for it to be approved, validated, and everything. So from the draft to proposed, we're looking at the format. We want something that is according to what we expect for CIPs, what we've laid out. So it needs to have a rationale, it needs to have that. So all of that is format-based. The way we're currently draft to proposed is the proposed, depending on the type of CIP, will need to have, for example, if you're pushing a protocol change, it needs to have a path to active that is defined with success criteria. It needs to have an actual working implementation, so we know that the technical idea is sound and actually works. And so that's what it takes to go from draft to propose. So an example right now is CIP1. We've been pushing the CIP that explains the CIP process, and that's the one we screen shared just right before this. It was originally following its own process. So again, we've had that conversation, which has happened with IOHK, Mirko, and Foundation and others before that. Then we went into moving it into the draft status. So it itself, the CIP1, went first through draft status. And the draft status was really looking at that. What is the format? Does it have everything that we said it should have? And all of that. So that was the draft phase. Now, from draft to proposed, the defining criteria for process CIP is that you want to have time to propose it formally through the forums, open it up to the community, and get everybody to weigh in on that. And we've had back and forth. We've had 20-minute video reviews by community members that go about what they like, what they don't like. This enables that conversation. It so happened that from the proposed to active after that, we've had that 30-day window, and we're about ready to move it to active. So I don't know, maybe that's something we can go into this. Sebastien, if you want to show us how that works, or if you want to talk about the CIP process and how we have the editors 2-week, I'm going to.
Yeah, so I just shared my screen. Hopefully everybody can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So as we mentioned before, the CIP process is hosted on GitHub, which is a tool that's often used by developers to handle code and the tracking history of how code has changed over time. So we use GitHub for the CIP process also. And for the CIP process, anybody can create a pull request, but to merge a pull request, you have to be a CIP editor. Okay. Now there are CIP editors right now that represent the Cardano Foundation, IOHK, and Emergo. And this is just the starting point, right? Obviously, we'll have more CIP editors going forward as we decentralize the process, but just as a kickoff, this is what we started with. So we decided for the rules of when we can make a CIP be considered active is we need to have sign off from one person from the CF, one person from IOHK, and one person from Emergo. And so you can see we have a proposal right here, a pull request right here. And what it does, if I open this up, is it changes the state of CIP1 from proposed to active. Okay, that's all this pull request does. And because, as Frederic said, we believe we've gotten enough feedback from the community that we think there's reasonable consensus around the proposal as it is. Okay, so you can see that Frederic up here, this is him, made this pull request. And you can see Matthias, who is right here, approved the pull request. And then I approved the pull request. So now we satisfied all the criteria. And now we can merge the pull requests right here, right? And so I just press the button and bada bing, bada boom. We've now got CIP1 in the active stage.
So Sebastien, you just made it CIP1 live right here on the Cardano effect. You just set it to active.
Yes, the CIP process is now open for everyone with an agreed upon process. Now, obviously, we have the CIP1 in the active stage, but that does not mean it's frozen forever, right? If at some point somebody in the future says, well, maybe the CIP1 should work this way instead, they can make an amendment to the CIP1, and then we can have a discussion about it and bring it to the community again. And so this happens in every blockchain. They occasionally amend their process. And if you look at CIP1, we actually talk about this, right? So we talk about how would you amend a proposal and the flow of going from active to obsolete, or going back and making amendments and all that. So if you want to know exactly how that works, we have that all explained here. And so although we're now active, if in the future you are not happy with a certain part of the process, you are more than welcome to open dialogue about what you think should be changed.
You mentioned reasonable consensus. How do you measure that within the community? How do you define that?
Yeah, for some processes, it's fairly easy, right? So for example, if a proposal makes it into the protocol and it's shipped as part of Cardano, then obviously it should be active, right? Because it's currently being used by the protocol. Now, obviously, for some things like a process CIP, it's much more vague, right? Because then it gets into what is governance, how do you make sure you have, governance on a process. And so this is why for the CIP1, we gave so much time for people to give in their input, which is, we put on Cardano forums, on Twitter, on Telegram, on all the platforms, and we watch through the videos people upload on YouTube. And when people engage with us, either through private message or YouTube videos, we reach out to them and talk to them and try and get them to agree on the process. And so that's why if you look at, the history of CIP1, you can see various posts and videos, and you can see us as the CIP editors engaging with them and discussing their concerns and addressing their concerns. And so that's how we kind of loosely define consensus. Everybody who had any objections, we've reached out to them, we've talked to them, and they're now happy with the proposal, right? Now, in other cases, it might not be as clear going forward because, for this one, it was, pretty clear. I don't have like a, percentage number, but, there's no person that is super upset with this. But in the future, we might have a process that's much more divisive, right? Yeah. So somebody might say like, oh, we should do this, but then, 50% approve and 45% disagree and 5% don't care. In which case, it becomes much harder. And you can see many examples of this in different blockchains. And it depends on the community how they want to set this kind of approval. But it's not on a general thing. For a process, it's mostly a governance decision.
And anyway, as you mentioned earlier, moving to active doesn't lock the process in any way, right? It just means that since one of those proposals are going to be technical solutions, it just means that, okay, this solution is in a state where it's ready to be implemented if someone needs to. But it doesn't prevent any future changes and improvements if someone have, some ideas or wants to review a bit what exists. So moving to active just means it's ready. It's ready to be used, right? It has been reviewed. People have agreed that it's a good idea. It's sound. It's ready to be implemented or to be used. Now, if you want to change it later on, well, feel free.
That sounds pretty good. What do you think, Rick?
I think it's pretty cool that you have a feedback loop for the feedback loop. If you can make a proposal that can improve the approval process, you can do that. If you have a proposal that you think is a good idea that could be related to how the system is governed, people have a mechanism for putting that in. So I think in the big picture of things, I think this process is an effective way to get customer input on how the product should work or the direction forward for the product. And I said customer input, but what it means is community input, stakeholder input, user input. You can get input from anybody using this process. That's what I'm seeing so far. That's what I learned from you guys this morning. Is that a good summary? Is that what I just found out here?
Yeah.
You're getting stakeholder input, community input, customer input, whatever you want.
And actually, even internally, it's also becoming much more automatic for us now. Like, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was having a discussion with Duncan on how we should agree on what type of prefixes we should use, for instance, for various data we have across Cardano, like the command lines and all of that. And we thought, okay, let's just make a CIP for that, right? So we can both discuss this thing, but also make it publicly available for people that are also willing to build tools on that. Right? So even internally, that's becoming something more common and something we want to go towards in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, because just as an example with the command line changes, I've seen the small changes that occurred in the last couple of weeks. And at first, my sons helped me operate the pool, and we look at it and go, oh, they changed that. Then after you look at it for a few minutes, you go, oh, that makes sense now, because it like putting the word file in there, wherever, the minor changes that you have made. So nice work on that. And I guess there was a lot of dialogue that went into how do we change this very small thing, because it has a big impact. Pretty much, right?
Always.
Okay. Always. Those little things have a big impact.
Rick, it's going to be interesting to see how this process evolves as we move from one era to the next. So as we move towards Gauguin and Voltaire, and when governance comes on, it's probably going to become a lot more interactive as a process. Is that right?
Over the long term?
Yeah, over the long term,
Yeah, it's going to, because right now, I mean, my main concern prior to this podcast, which is no longer a concern, is how do I get inputs? How do I make inputs to the process? I didn't understand it. I do understand what Voltaire is and governance. I mean, I have a general idea, but I didn't know how. So now I'm getting a better understanding of how. And I'll give you some examples. Hurdles we'll need to come over, or hurdles we'll need to overcome is you may have people in the financial industry out there who are geniuses. They are geniuses at finance, right? But they might not know how to GitHub, right? They might not know how to operate GitHub. So they're going to have to team up with people, put their heads together and say, look, I'm going to provide my financial insight to this person who's going to actually use GitHub to implement the process and then follow up and go through the process. So it's probably going to take a team effort moving forward when you start having big decisions, or not big decisions, but big ideas going into the Cardano improvement process, because I anticipate you're going to see a lot of big ideas come from outside of the core engineering teams, and you'll see it coming from across all aspects of the industry. So this is their process.
Rick, I just wanted to add, because I feel like this is very analogous to government contracting. When you're priming and subbing for a particular contract, the prime company may not have the expertise to actually build the product like you were saying. And it's going to take a lot of collaboration. So a lot of primes and subs in order to create a process or create a succinct CIP proposal and then move that process forward. So it's going to be a big collaboration event.
Yeah. And I'm kind of on the fence about some things too. For example, some things I think personally, just my opinion is, or they're purely engineering decisions where I want engineers to make those decisions because it just makes sense. Like, let's say we're having a community vote on something, and should we build a bridge and how do you design the bridge? Well, I think the community would vote on how should we build the bridge and are we going to pay for the bridge? But I want engineers to decide how to build the bridge. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think it's kind of interesting. So some of the proposals I think will be engineering centric, where, we need engineers looking at that and agreeing on the best way forward. And then other big ideas will be coming up in the future, and they'll be put out as Cardano improvement proposals, and that is going to require a forum or consensus. Yeah, it's going to require the consensus. It's going to require a lot of buy-in because it's going to make a massive impact. And is that the general idea we got here, Frederic? Is that what we were looking for?
I don't know. I mean, so you're talking about like a really broad. You're touching to a lot of things that we're pushing out until a little bit later. So I feel that the CIP itself is about documenting and a formal way of documenting and communicating. But then like building that consensus, I mean, it's you have like so many chains that build consensus different ways. And for the process, as a process, we can separate the voting and have that on a parallel track and just say like, hey, what bridge do we want to build? Like, do we want to build this bridge? Yes, no. It's fully separate from the CIP. I mean, that could be, there are some interactions and symbiosis that can definitely happen. I think they've not yet been defined fully, but that's coming up surely in the future, I'm sure. Okay. And
That's the third time during this podcast you told me the CIP is for communicating, not for decision making. I keep getting derailed. That's why it's so important to communicate this well.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned engineers here that you want them to have a choice and make sure they make the right decisions, but the engineer will always be in control of the tools they are building. The CIP is just a place they can go and pick possible solutions that they find relevant and sound, right? But in the end, they are still making the decision that this is the CIP I want to implement because as an engineer, I think this is a great solution, right?
Yes. Again, the catalog reference. Go through the catalog and find the solutions you think work best.
Yeah, and if the catalog doesn't have the solution you're looking for, then, well, you design it and possibly, well, it would be very nice. You document it and make it a CIP.
Nice.
Right.
All right. Well, we're approaching the top of the hour, Philippe.
Rick, I just had one more question. Mm-hmm. If the ITN continues, is there going to be a separate CIP process for both the ITN and the mainnet? I just want to know.
That question.
He's like, this is probably the wrong crowd to ask.
No. The reason is that the CIP here is for Cardano, right? But ideas in there are more general, right? They solve technical problems that you might have also on other blockchains, right? So you might have, I don't know, people from Ethereum implementing a CIP, right? That could be possible. So having both the Jormungandr and the Cardano node folks agreeing on a CIP and implementing it in both platforms could happen. Actually, has happened already.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'll reemphasize, because Matthias just explained it to us again, the CIP process is not Voltaire, and Voltaire is not the CIP process, right? Did we get that far in this podcast?
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so.
That's right.
Frederic, I'm looking, I got an okay for you. Frederic, did I get it right?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
The CIP is a tool that feeds into Voltaire for sure.
Okay.
Down the line, there's going to be other tools and other elements. I just want to bring back like one element from this. It was really fun to do this podcast. One thing is that we've now moved the CIP1 into active, and therefore we're going to start processing more and more CIPs into the repository, but it's also a signal for the community to start building up consensus or discussing things they would like to get implemented or CIPs they would like to try pushing through. I think that we're right at that stage.
So what should I do, Frederic? Should I make an account on GitHub? And if I see a CIP I currently like, I click like on it? I click the thumbs up button?
You don't have to. You can just go to the developer forums and start talking about the ideas that are significant to you. You don't need to go into GitHub. That's the part where, as a non-technical person, you can having an idea and just start framing it or having the conversation, and then go into the repository if you want, or somebody else will go in the repository and they're expected to just summarize or just like synthesize the conversation into a CIP, which is just a formal document. That's it. It's a file. It's a formal document, and they will be able to press, fork and submit pull request And what that is, fork is you just clone the repository to your local place, and then like you do the change of the file, which means like you add a file in the code repository itself, which is like your CIP. You set it up according to the format defined in CIP1, according to the markdown. So you have the rationale, you have the copyright, and so on. And then you do the pull request to the Cardano Foundation GitHub repository, which functionally just means, hey, Cardano Foundation CIP repository, I have made a change that I would like for you to pull into your repository. So that's what happens. So the change is really your CIP that is then pulled in that CIP Cardano Foundation repository and becomes draft and gets to then be processed formally through the statuses, and that's within the repository. So that's like draft to propose to active and the other ones.
Excellent. That was a great summary. We will make sure we get the links to CIP1 posted in the description down below. Is there any other links? We'll talk about it after the podcast, but we'll make sure people have the right links so they can read up on everything that you guys have described during this podcast. But how does the process work is good. Anything else, Philippe? You want to wrap us up and take us out?
Yeah, I think that's it. So I want to thank Frederic, Matthias, and Sebastien for joining us today, talking about CIP processes. And I think it's a great step forward. You guys are always welcome on the podcast. Thank you to everyone who's watching this episode. Please remember to like, comment, and share. And we appreciate your support. And the floor is yours. Do you have any last words for the viewers and listeners of the Cardano Effect? We'll start with you, Frederic.
I'm good. Really happy to be here. Looking forward to helping Cardano grow as an ecosystem community and pushing the CIP as a communication platform.
All right. Thank you. Matthias?
So far we've been the only one writing CIPs. So I'm really looking forward to reviewing proposals from various engineers in the Cardano ecosystem. I know we have very great people in the community. So if you have ideas, I encourage everyone to contribute, make a CIP, and engage.
Thank you, Matthias. Sebastien?
Yeah, one thing I want to say, we've seen a lot of people in the community make issues on the Jormungand or GitHub repository, saying like, I want this is what I think we should change, this is why I think we should change it. You no longer need to do this. Now you've got a great place to go where you can, formally write your idea and get it, reviewed by a team of editors. And so if you've been involved in Jormungand and testnet and you want to get involved in the process going forward, this should be your new home, and hopefully you like the process we've set up.
Okay. All right. Until the next episode of the Cardano Effect. Bye, everyone.